Hola! Welcome, everyone. Welcome back, I would say, because as you saw a moment ago, we were talking to our amigo Joel, and this is just beginning. It's early here at the PNSQC conference here at Portland, Oregon. And I happened to walk into another amigo that I'm super happy to finally have here and be able to have a conversation, learn a lot of lots of experience. And well, without further, with you we have Greg Paskal.
Yes.
Amigo Greg, welcome.
Thank you later.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yes.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm really enjoying the conference. The talk I just heard was incredible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you were just coming out of
I did a talk
right?
on IoT and testing, which is something I'm very passionate about as well.
You know, IoT is a term that has not ringed that much lately.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, the metaverse and the blockchain and now AI and everything,
Mhm.
but still out there, and it's really important. Not that many people pay attention to it.
Yes.
But before we dive into these topics and into all this fun stuff that we have been experiencing here in the conference, would you mind sharing with the audience who are you, what's the deal with you, and
Of course.
why did you end up here
Yeah.
presenting in this conference? We'll get into that in a moment. But
Well, yeah, I'm Greg Paskal. I've been working in testing for 40 years now, which is incredible to think
Wow.
about how long that's been. I started when I was about 19 years old, and I've really
That's young.
enjoyed it. Yeah, I got a very fortunate break when I was young in the aerospace. I worked for a company called Hughes Aircraft Company, started by Howard Hughes,
Yeah.
and it was an amazing experience. And that's where I was introduced to concepts of testing. I was very, of course, this is very early in computing, so we were building a lot of hardware and things like that. But I've enjoyed it. I love this field. Like many testers, I'm one of those folks that tore everything apart and tried to figure out how it worked. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that idea as well. And somewhere along this journey, I realized not only did I love it, but I love to teach it and help others to pursue it and become what I call craftsmen in the work of testing. Something beyond just making a living, but something you really love. It becomes your career, a passion. And I'm really drawn to try to help those folks to do it really well and mature our whole craft of testing. Yeah.
That's pretty awesome, and I didn't foresee this connection. Hughes airplanes and all these engineering pieces. I'm sure it was a lot of fun there. 40 years ago, I mean, you were dealing mostly with hardware, more.
That's right. We had to build all that hardware as well.
That was and it's an interesting intersection. Now I understand why are you excited about Internet of Things.
Yes.
I see the connections there,
Mhm.
and it's really cool, this evolution that you had, that you jumped into testing things. And how was that transition? Mind sharing a little bit, like what you were working on, or did you dive straight into testing, into QA? And
I didn't really have my first title as a QA engineer till about 15 years ago. But before that, I don't even know if I knew the term quality assurance. I would say we were testing. I don't even think we called ourselves test engineers. The roles were, again, you were having to build a lot of your own hardware. I automated things then, but I wouldn't call myself an automation engineer. And it was writing automation on Apple IIs and having to build the hardware to interface with the very circuits that we were testing and building, which were components that were launched on rockets into space for satellites. So it was a fascinating time to be a technologist because it's got a very grassroots kind of, you get your hands dirty in the components, the code. And I feel fortunate to have kind of come along at the right time for that, that season in technology.
it sounds a little bit like, for me, I'm gonna draw an analogy. I grew up with cassette players.
Yeah.
I grew up without a cell phone, without any wire with me, and lived through that evolution. I'm sure that what you're describing is a little bit like that. You
Yes.
saw what was before in terms of IT and technology, hardware, and how everything has been evolving and getting connected, put together, all these interactions. And I don't know, in those, like, early days, or in your, because the very first years, well, several, for what I can hear, was mostly oriented at technology, but probably we all do testing here and there, and we don't know in the early days. But what was kind of like the most entertaining or fascinating experience that you had on that journey that you could share? Because I'm sure that you had quite a bit.
Yeah, I would say the blend of understanding how hardware works gave me a great advantage when I got into working through software, because we were working with serial interfacing, and we understood data at the I/O level because we literally would watch it on an oscilloscope transition, and so we understand the distinct differences between bytes and bits, because bits matter, and that's a common area that, for a lot of folks I mentor, they miss that. They kind of when they talk about their bandwidth coming into their house, they're enamored by the bit bandwidth, but they don't realize you've got to divide that by 8 to really be anything meaningful to them in their house. So a lot of folks hadn't had that opportunity to be involved in the earlier days of computing, and honestly, there's 20 and 30 years that precede that were years I was just a kid tinkering around with batteries and wire and magnets and experimenting how to do electronics. So again, very fortunate to have come through that series when you could buy a computer. Some of the more senior folks out there may have done the same things I did, where they worked on 6502 machines. That might have been like a VIC-20 or an early Apple system or something like that. So when you know systems like that, you at some point on your journey, you recognize nothing's new under the sun. It's just become faster, and maybe there's more capacity to store it. There's some speed, but at the end of the day, these are still flip-flops and transistors, switching state, and so it's less scary to kind of you don't see it as such a black box necessarily.
I remember some of days that you would get only like a wood pane and just start like putting components and building up your own computers like from scratch, and even like, okay, now I have a computer, how do I input and output this thing?
Correct.
And when you mentioned the oscilloscope, like you would see not the bytes, the bits that is up there, the signal. Down there, there's
That's
one,
right.
that's
zero.
1
and 0.
It's not even painted in a text file or a text editor that you can see. No, you are literally seeing it's 1, it's 0, and there's a lot of fun. Sampling sizes, how often should you modulate and demodulate for all of these things?
When you realize everything is just represented by 1s and 0s, right? Now it takes away some of the mystery of maybe how an image works or how data is transmitted when you convert it into, let's say, a JSON format, and you're sending it, through the web. Well, it's still a serial connection. You're still sending 1s and 0s. You're just sending basically a package of data that's been encrypted into this format and send it out in a serial format. So it's less mysterious, so it can give you an advantage as a technologist. But even very current technologists could still be mentored and trained in these basics. It gives them an advantage. Those are the things I like to teach those young engineers that want to be mentored, because I feel like it almost gives them a superpower. They have X-ray vision all of a sudden to the way that's actually working, and it allows them to find defects and risk very in a different way than those that don't understand that.
And it's really important because a friend of mine, very young, we were going a group of friends to a cabin, and there was no Wi-Fi and no one could bring the Spotify.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, don't worry, I have a bunch of MP3s. I have a playlist, my local playlist of MP3s, like from the Napster days, and like old playlist. And she was like, how is that? You don't have internet. How are you getting music? MP3. Yeah. What is that? Oh boy. How do I? And even like some of those, like going back and explaining some of the foundations behind of what. Even us, I was going to say new generations take for granted, but there's so much underneath, like assembler code and understanding the carriers, the variables. How do you have to build on top? We are kind of like 4 tiers above now.
Yes, it's a lot of abstraction. From that stuff. Yes, and it can generate, even for developers or testers, again, this kind of black box that they're not really sure what's happening down there, and can consume a lot of time because I call it rubbing the rabbit's foot. You begin to try all kinds of things that you don't really have a reason or logic for it. You're like, well, I don't know, try turning it off and on again, right? Try connecting to a different Wi-Fi, but they're lacking necessarily the fundamental troubleshooting skills that would help them maybe reduce or discover the solution, 50% faster. So some of that just comes from the benefit of being exposed to that stuff earlier, and some of it comes because there's a pursuit to want to understand it. So I like that. I'm a learner, so I'm always wanting to learn and grow and understand how things are working, so I can debug them well. Yeah.
So, and to debug it for yourself, you're sharing the knowledge, you are training people, you're teaching them, you're here in conferences, going around and giving talks, giving tutorials, mini maxi tutorials. You have all sorts of flavors. So tell us, what are you presenting here this time in PNSQC?
Sure. I'm presenting 2 talks. This afternoon, I'm doing a talk I've done quite a few times, but it's a good foundational talk. It's called The 7 Fundamentals of a Successful Test Team. And it gives some good foundational pieces that someone like a quality manager or even a test engineer could look at and say, are these pieces in place in my team? Even for me as an individual, do I have these working parts, and is it something I should approach? And then tomorrow I'm teaching a half-day workshop on something I'm real excited about. I've taught this course for quite some time, and I have a whole Udemy course on this now, cool. On a methodology called METS. It stands for the Minimal Essential Test Strategy. For those viewers that are interested, you can go to metstesting.com, METS testing.com, and it will tell you all about it. And the principle of it was something I developed when I was at FedEx. I initially was owned by a company called Kinko's, and Kinko's was purchased by FedEx. And it was actually one of the first times I had the role of a quality engineer, the first time I was given a kind of a QA title. I ran into that classic problem of something getting thrown over the wall and not having a lot of time to test it. And I don't know about you, but when I'm under the gun like that with stress and pressure, that's usually not when my best game shows up. It tends to be the brain checks out, and I'm like, I got to do, whatever.
Blue screen and everything.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys can all relate to that. We all know what that's like. So there's, kind of the psychology of being a human and a tester. These are things that can generate a risk, right? And so I literally just started to write down a list of things like, next time, this, I call it a fire drill, shows up where I've got to test something and I've only got an hour. Why don't you remember to test these 2 or 3 things? Out of that came a whole list. And then I wound up building the METS methodology. And it's one of the very first talks I gave at STAR, I would say close to 20 years ago now.
Yeah. 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow. So, I mean, truly veteran, full of knowledge, full of experience from different fields that you wouldn't even believe, because many of the testers that we walk into nowadays, people watching, if you're not familiar with some of these things, hardware, connectivity, true, what is happening in the back end, performance engineers that do not know what is a queue for a CPU, how it works, and how can that affect some of these things, basic concepts and some basic QA concepts that you get from all that experience. Man, I can STAR conference 20 years ago as I feel so new on the scene that I'm very happy to have you here. And from your first workshop, something that I got curious right away, mind spoiling, what are these 7 characteristics, principles that you look for? I want to know if I have any of them.
Well, let me just list a few off the top of my head. Probably some of the first ones I would recommend for any team is that they have a common language they speak. So I talk about just the terminology we use. I personally like the ISTQB training concepts, and when I work with a team, I really encourage my test engineers to get their CTFL, which is kind of a foundational testing certification. Now, you can do this a lot of ways. You don't necessarily have to go through ISTQB, but as a team, you want to have a common definition for things. So For instance, earlier this morning, I heard a reference to the term happy path testing. This is a great example of where terminology actually can cause risk into the very work that you're doing. And I would imagine a number of you have used that term, and maybe you use it regularly. So as a team, isn't it interesting? What when you think about happy path testing, what else is left? Sad path testing, right?
And no one pays attention to that. I've never heard that term. No one is like,
yeah. Well, but what's interesting is most defects aren't found at either ends of those things. Most defects are found at boundary value analysis testing, at the boundary testing. And so you never really hear people talk about melancholy testing. And here's a good example of where the language we have chose is actually introducing new risk into the very testing we're doing, because we have chosen a term of happy. The only other real option is sad, which is what we would call negative testing. But when you learn testing principles well, you find most defects happen at the boundary of where two things come together. And it's an intentional type of testing known as boundary testing. It happens to be a version of positive and negative testing, but it's right at the edge where it transitions. So here's a good example. As a team, you might decide, let's define the terms we use for the type of testing we're doing. And in this case, I would coach a team away from using happy path, because it actually has this very problem. And I would say adopt something that now allows you to have discussions around things that are in between. So I would probably coach you towards positive, negative, and boundary as your terms. But there's a whole list of these terms. You don't need to necessarily have a PhD in them, but probably understanding a good dozen of those terms will help you a lot. Like even the term bug. I just came from a company that had a different definition for bug and defect.
oh, wow.
And talk about adding a risk into the the product and potentially into the culture of the company. And so really there's a defect is a defect is a defect, or if you're going to call it a bug, but don't use defect and bug to mean two different things. That's asking for trouble. And I think that's a great example of where a company has adopted a term that can actually introduce more risk than help.
You just made me think of some past experiences, especially quick pause. We have a message from Jim Hassan.
Oh, hey, Jim.
Hola, Jim. Hello.
Hello, Jim.
He says, hey, Greg and Leandro, enjoying the conversation. Thank you, Jim. We're happy to.
Yeah.
I hope that you learned a lot, right?
Yeah, we were just chatting on LinkedIn this last week or so. So that's really great.
Oh,
yeah.
So stay tuned, Jim.
That's good,
Jim. So you made me think of some experiences. I as a consultant, I came to an organization that were needing services. And we had like a week of discussions because I was telling them, you don't need automations for everything. You can skip some automations, some parts you should do manually, and some others don't even apply it.
Mm-hmm.
And after a week of very long, heated conversations and meetings, one of the employees in that organization pulls me, like, dude, I think I have identified what's the problem. I'm like, what? People here refer to functional testing as automations. Oh. And you are telling them to not to do functional testing. And that's where they are getting scandalized for what you're like.
Interesting.
How did that happen? Mm-hmm. Like, and that's right for what you're saying. And in performance testing, we also have some terms that have no universal consensus on what it means.
Yes.
Is it a load test? Is it a performance test? And that's where there's also some other confusions. Is it an endurance or a stamina test, and many other names that we know or describe? And if we don't come to a common language, we're going to be arguing for weeks or even doing wrong things. Yes. I love that recommendation.
Yes, that's a great example of using bug and defect.
Or issue.
If you or issue.
Nowadays, that issue is like coming as a common term. I have seen people log defects on the issue section, and that drives me nuts. But it's like, you don't have a common language for that.
As a quality manager, this should be one of your really high priority tasks, is getting your team to talk the same language, at least define them. Can you imagine if someone from my previous company came in and had a different definition for what a bug and a defect was, and you began to use that lingo, and they were using it in a very different term, just like the example you have there. So it's probably good to baseline some of these terms. I wound up defining about a dozen or so for our developers, because they also were using their own lingo, and they had a different perspective. The great examples are words like regression. Let's talk about what a regression is. A regression simply means something that was in a state that's become of a lesser state. But for many quality teams, when they talk about regression testing, what they really mean is run all the test cases.
Another cycle. Let's do it.
That's right. And that's not what regression is all about at all. So you really rather not redefine these terms. So find a standard you can live with, and then spell them out for the team so you all are communicating. That's probably the first one I bring emphasis to. And through the course of my class, I go into things like automation, and I cover maybe how to go about selecting the right things to automate, because that is a very expensive task. Automation is one of those places where you can spend enormous amounts of time and money and have absolutely nothing to show for it, because you may have automated things that aren't ready to be automated, or they really don't provide a whole lot of value at the end of the day. If you've ever followed me on my YouTube channel, which is at craftoftesting.com, you'll have learned that I talk about the nature of testing in general, that good and bad testing look exactly the same from 6 feet away. So the untrained eye doesn't know difference. It just looks like busy activity. And busy activity can appear to be something someone might even pay for. The quality manager might be excited because he's able to fulfill the budget needs and paying your payroll, but it's producing no risk. So it's some of those fundamental things I really try to lay out, that there needs to be wisdom in the work that we do. Yeah.
It's as well when, and this was a very big question yesterday. We had an automation panel where the discussions got interesting, and this question came up like, should I have 100% coverage of automations, and what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Which, as you were saying, I've seen teams automating for the sake of automation, and
that's crazy.
Because I have to have 100% coverage. Yeah, we have this
impossible
task function in our solution. What should we automate on that? I don't know. Let's do something. Okay. And
that's right. Isn't it interesting that numbers can get you in trouble? I've heard all kinds of things. Well, we have 80% coverage. As soon as I hear that, I know, all right, I'm dealing with a team that probably doesn't have a lot of experience in automating, or the things that are motivating them in their test approach might not be the things that reduce risk and quality. And lots of things can incentivize a company to put a team together, to hire a manager, and do what looks like testing from the outside, just because they think they need that. I really emphasize this idea that a quality engineer and the quality manager need to be folks that have a high level of integrity. This work is hard because you're going to be, in some cases, the bearer of very hard news. So you need a manager that's going to back you up when you need to share something difficult. You need caring in the way to realize somebody has poured their hard work and their creative talents into something you have to look at. And that risk can come from a lot of different areas, including, by the way, what I call a shift up risk. I just wrote a paper on this, 360 degrees of risk. And I've identified that while most of us talk about shift left, there are other dimensions of testing, 5 of them at least, that I discuss in that paper. Of course, shift left. Shift up, which means it comes from the leadership and it's weighed down. Shift down, which means it comes from the team that's not properly trained, prepared, like language issues. Shift right, that defects that exist at the deployment area. Most quality engineers have no idea how their code is deployed to production. And yet defects can show up there if we're so focused on, let's say, deploying code quickly, and yet we have a flaky deployment pipeline. There's a quality issue. That's a bug. And then probably my most favorite is what I call reflective risk. Reflective risk is just a time you try to be honest, you look in the mirror and you say, what risks do I bring to the table? We all bring them. And so it might be that I don't have the proper training. It could be that I don't have domain experience. Maybe I've been asked to test mobile and I don't have a lot of mobile experience other than my phone. There could be a number of things there. So man, there's so much space to explore when it comes to quality engineering, that you're so much more than a tester. I want to encourage you. And some of you, you're okay with that. But for those of you that really love what we do, I want to encourage you past that idea of I just run test cases, because there's great scope here for us to own specialty areas and really do it exceptionally well.
It's I always compare the testing specialization that many of us do or have, like the field of medicine. Some of us may be like family doctor generalists at some level, but there are all sorts of directions that you can specialize or open your horizons in terms of a QA. Because as you very well said, and I never thought of it, I've heard like up, down, left, right, shifting. And you got me like thinking on more directions, even like a sphere or something like that, like up to management and explain, measure, and have things for management that they care about or is useful for them, and both of the teams. From the middle to management, you have also like a good translation situation, because many of the things that you're referring are lost in translation problems, and down to the developers, shift front to the front end, that automatically you know what your users are having. Shift back to the back end, because you as well.
Great point. Yeah.
All these huge, I don't know, panorama of QA situations is really great to bring them up and help people to identify with these points.
Yeah.
I'm still hung up a little bit on the 7 points. I love that concept, because you're putting like the dots in the eyes where like, hey, are you kind of like, first of all, talking the same language?
Yeah.
All of you. And you just made me think as well, like management and QA, sometimes we have like a big disconnect, and we may make a big report out of like, I don't know, a locator that is not working on the management doesn't care about that. It's like, is the software broken? Should I care, or are we good? That's all I care. And some of those things we may be reporting differently. And I mean, still, again, I was saying on those 7 points, which one is, aside of the one, because you remember the language one probably is the most impactful for you.
Sure.
What's number 2?
Off the top of my head, I need my
It's
deck
tough.
here in front of me. Yeah. But there, all these different fundamentals are important for folks to come around. You probably could write them down yourself, because it wasn't necessarily rocket science to pull them together. I just stepped back and looked at what do we do as a team that helps us to grow. I can think of a next logical one that I certainly believe in, which is hiring the right talent. It's a reality that a lot of us have faced when we work with our HR teams, that people who wind up in QA sometimes had their sights focused on a very different role within the company. And they were given QA as a consolation prize. And it's a very unfortunate thing. A lot of folks that want to go into dev wind up getting into QA because they didn't pass the coding challenge or whatever it might have been. And yet the recruiter might say, well, we've got a position open in QA. Well, let's be honest. If you were in that role, what would you be thinking? I'd be thinking, well, I need to put food on my table, so I'm not going to turn down a job. And as soon as I can find an opening to get into development, I'm going to do that. Now, a guy like me, if I'm pouring a year or two of mentoring into that individual, that's an enormous investment. And imagine that person's sights are really set on development, and they leave. You've now taken an enormous amount of effort in my training that could have been put to another individual, and it's lost because they've moved into a different role. So I think hiring people who have a love for test engineering, and I would call it engineering, and quality is really important. So I don't love this idea that QA has become the consolation prize.
No.
It's a very unfortunate place. If you, as a test engineer, are in that role, I almost think you need the ability to communicate with your manager what your true intentions are, so they can get a good team in there. Not that you're not a good team member, but they can get a good team that's really focused on the quality aspects and know your intentions, so they can get you moved into the role you really want to be in as well. But I like the fact that I'm seeing more in the pay scale is now starting to flatten out. It should be happening in your organization. If it's not, but you should be finding that your top quality engineers should be in the same space as your developers as far as pay. If not, now you need to ask some questions, because across the board in our community, that is beginning to happen more and more. Thankfully, it's because the practice of what we do as engineering is starting to get recognized. Like, this is a real engineering field, and it's worth, kind of paying the worker the appropriate wage for what he does. Yeah.
And it still impresses me. And I remember before I became a tester, I was a developer, and that it's almost like a second-class citizen or something like that. Seen not that much anymore, still some places, but even with my developer friends, I'm like, yeah, I moved into testing, and now I do like feeling bad, like really, like I was giving bad news, and I'm like, I'm a tester. That's cool. And it's I don't know, it's misunderstood, underappreciated, because you really need quality on your software. You can be a very good developer, understand and have all the classes and methods developed and implemented, but we're human, and some of these mistakes are gonna power through and end up in production, and we don't want those things.
Yeah.
I love what you're saying, that this investment in this person, to whoever it is, giving the tools to become a good QA engineer. And I like that you call it a quality engineer, not just a tester, not just a scripter.
Yeah.
Because many confuse that that's all there is to testing. And that the learning that you invested in this person, even if they go to another field, I'm not so sad about that, because they bring that knowledge to those.
Yes.
It permeates, want it or not. And many times they come back. It's like 1 year into testing, it's like, frequently happens by accident, but once a tester, always a tester. I don't think that you can get out of it that easily.
That's a really good point. I agree. The investment is still worth it. When I interview test engineers that might be looking for a role, one of my favorite things to tell them, this is just the way I'm wired, is I'm there to pour into them everything I can. I look at it as an act of stewardship, in a way, that I have a season with this individual, and I want to take good care of them. So I want to give them not only the skills to do their job, but skills for their career. It's almost like a benefit, right? That HR probably won't put down, but you're going to come away from this role. Let's assume in 5 or 10 years, you need to relocate. It's just family issue, whatever it is. It's very satisfying knowing we've given you great skills. You can continue to take good care of your family. And I think people want to feel like we genuinely care about them, right? And so investing in them in that sort of way is, in a way, a benefit we can bring to a quality team. If you've got folks that are senior and can mentor in the work, it requires humility on your part to recognize when you don't know what you don't know. I think you have to model that. I think you need to have that modeled from your leader as well, because they're not going to know everything. You really don't want to be micromanaged. There's a lot of dynamics that entail a great quality team. But it really starts with the ability to know you don't know everything, and to be teachable, and a number of these things that I see as making a big difference.
And I think all that you were mentioning, you are actually acting on it. I can see you're giving back, you're helping people, and you're pretty active out there. You were mentioning your YouTube channel. So to ramp down, I would like if you can share, where can people find you? Because you generate quite a decent amount of material that can help people to excel in their testing endeavors, even if they don't think themselves as testers or QA engineers.
That's I love that. Well, I'm really easy to find on Google. If you just type Greg Paskal, it's just Greg Paskal. You may be surprised how much comes up. And I do have a lot of content online.
You have a YouTube channel?
I do.
That as well?
The YouTube channel is at if you go to craftoftesting.com, it'll redirect you right to my YouTube channel. I have multiple websites. What a surprise, right? I think I must have close to 20 domains, but those related to just testing are probably 4 or 5. So the main domains would be metstesting.com. That's my whole METS methodology. Realworldtestautomation.com. contains 50 plus blog articles I've written, all sorts of white papers. From there, you can link to all kinds of content that I've been developing online. I have craftoftesting.com as a redirect, but hope to eventually turn that into maybe more of a common repository for some of my stuff. I'm on LinkedIn a ton. I mean, I've got just an endless amount of information out there. Oh, and I'm published. So if you're looking for a book, I wrote a book on automation a number of years ago. It's not a how-to, it's more around a why-to. It gives you some very high-level principles that can be applied. It really doesn't matter what tool you're using. At the time, I was using QTP a lot. Cool. So you're going to have that vibe to it, but it can apply to really even a modern tool set. And I just converted that into an Audible book a couple years ago, which was really fun. So that's also available on Audible, and that book is called Test Automation in the Real World. So I love connecting with this audience. So please find me on LinkedIn and let's connect, because I love to hear from the community, and I love pouring into everybody and doing what I can to help you. So I'm up for that. Feel free to connect with me.
Thank you so much, Greg. And as well, for the few videos that I have seen from your YouTube channel, I love your setup. I love how it looks. It sounds awesome. Like I was like, yeah, this is one of mine. I know. I enjoy it, and keep rocking. I like a lot all the content, all the help, books, and especially quick question. Yeah. Was it challenging to land a tech book into an audio format?
Not really, not too hard. I mean, certain things are a little harder to translate, but I think because it was very story driven, sometimes I deviated maybe from the text of the book to try to put a little bit in there so people could get their arms around
like a picture without a picture.
Yeah. So it is a pretty quick read too. So it would be worthwhile, to go through it.
Available on Amazon.
That's available on Amazon and Audible. And I think you can even find it on Apple now. So like I said, if you just Google me and you look for stuff, you'll find it all over the place. And I really love, again, and if you get to subscribe and we get to connect on LinkedIn, you'll find I do publish pretty often. And I'm always thinking and trying to help prompt and encourage you to take each week and maybe bump up your skills a little bit. And it's just the way this guy's wired.
That's the attitude. I love it, amigo Greg. There you have it. Google Greg Paskal, and you'll get a plethora of information, knowledge, experience, articles, books, videos. So it's a waterfall of knowledge. This guy, I love it. Greg, thank you so much for coming and showing it. Has been just a pleasure.
Love it. Yes.
And everyone watching, this is not over. We have still some more interviews here at PNSQC 2023 in Portland. Jim just logged off, said was arguing, is it a bug, a defect, an issue, an anomaly, a rose by another name, any other name. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
But Jim had to go. Jim, if you're seeing this in the future, we read your comments. Thank you very much. If anyone else wants to bring some comments and questions for these gurus that we are bringing into these interviews, very welcome. Now, we are not done yet. There are going to be a few more interviews during this day. I hope to have some more people willing to come and share the knowledge as much as Greg has done. And stay tuned, because as well, our friend Jonathan Wright asked here the organizers if we could stream his talk so that you can participate. He wants participation. Stay tuned, because later today, I think it's at 2:30 to 15. I'll be posting on the exact time so that you can join and participate, send questions. It seems that it's going to be very interactive. So stay tuned, amigo Greg. Thank you again.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. And we're going offline. Stay tuned, because we'll be back. With that, Leandro out and Greg out. Adios.